It's an honor to have you guys here today, and I think it's a God thing. Our church has always valued creativity, and that is certainly something that's flown down from our senior pastors as they have pioneered in a way, ways that we can reach our community using creativity. And Pastor Peter's, tapping Pastor Bev on the knee there because we owe a lot to her for that, and we thank you, Pastor Bev, and that's opened the door for a lot of us to just kind of step in and just use our giftings and talents and just kind of jump in and be a part of what God's doing here because of them. And so I think it's cool. We have been putting a lot of emphasis just in the this year even on creativity. And so I don't know about you guys, but I see it as a God thing that we have Pastor Phil Pringle and Pastor Chardon Lewis here this year of all years, and also Pastor Reverend Samuel, who's just produced a movie. And so that's cool. And so, no coincidences, right? Both of you are creative legends. Pastor Phil he's an artist, those of you who don't know, and he, creativity is such a value for you in your church. I've seen it and been blessed by it. Pastor Chardon as well, he's a creative genius, and he builds creative communities, and he's a huge part of the City Point worship team and all that kind of thing. And so we just want to say thank you for being here today. And both of you, I know, are into maximizing people and pulling the giftings out of them for the kingdom. And I think that's the emphasis we've been trying to talk about at the moment, is how can we pull the giftings and the talents out of people to be used to build the kingdom, and to use creativity that's going to build the church in the future. And so to start wide and almost philosophically, and I don't know who can answer this, but I'll leave it to either of you. How would you define creativity? And by that I mean, more specifically, where would you sit on the spectrum of where creativity is? Like, is it something objective, some force like in Star Wars that only a few people can access? Or is it something that is inside each and every one of us?
Every single one of us are created in the image of a creator. So you are creative. And so that's the first misnomer about creative people, is that they are a select few, or that they're an isolated, exclusive club. Every single person in this room is creative. But you may not be creative in a traditional view that music and art, that generally most people think creatives are guitar players, singers, or artists. But truly create is to bring something out of nothing. And so anybody who's invented a motor or the capacity to create something out of your imagination that's useful for humanity at any level is a phenomenal gift that is in every one of us. And there would be 10 things that block creativity, and I'm not teaching on it right now, but there definitely are blockages to people discovering their creativity. But it's important to note, and I'll pass over to Chardon on this one, that I read a book a couple of years ago called Why Right-Brainers Will Rule the World. And we're definitely moving in culture from left brain to right brain dominance, meaning the creatives are going to rule the world, because robots can't create. They can only reproduce the information that's been fed into them. So to bring something that's never been done before out of nothing, out of the spirit of a creator inside of us, is something no robot, no artificial intelligence, nothing of the future is going to be able to do. They can replicate what others have done, but to actually forge new avenues. And it is phenomenal what people have done in the last few years. I think small thinking is another blockage to creativity. Who would have ever thought let's map every road in the world? I mean, that is just a ridiculous thought, right? But now it's been done by several companies. Who would have thought I'm going to invent in a complete brain a disk operating system, and it'll drive every artificial thinking on the earth? Well, he did it, and Mr. Gates did it. 10,000 hours of working all day long. Now there's several code platforms that have been created, Android and others. There's X, Linux, and it's like somebody thought of doing something, and now you got Elon Musk thinking about landing on Mars, populating Mars. Just everybody's going, yeah, right, what a crazy thought. But these are the kind of thoughts that creatives must get into a bigger thinking about how the world can be. Yeah,
that's awesome.
I agree. I think if you were to null and void the thought that you are not creative, like if you were to say, I don't identify in that way, you would be null and voiding that you are made in the image of God. And for me, I find creativity comes sometimes through boredom. Sometimes we're so busy we don't have time to create. I find when I pause for a moment or recluse for a moment, and when I have those almost boredom seasons is when I'm the most creative or innovative. And so fast, I know a lot of young people that are creative and innovative in business and coming up with new inventions. That's a form of creativity. I would echo Pastor Phil. I think when I think of creating, I think there's so many more art forms yet to be created. Like I think in a modern day with social media, creativity is a modern day evangelist. You know, back in the day, if you're an evangelist, you'd try to get to every person on every street corner. Now you've got graphic designers that are creating some kind of beauty, and millions within 30 seconds are being evangelized to. And so I think creativity is expanding in the modern day that we're in, which excites me, that there's new opportunities to be creative and to represent who our God is, the ultimate creator. So yeah.
You know, on that point, there's a pretty interesting comparison between Michelangelo and Savonarola.
Absolutely.
And I reckon none of you have heard of Savonarola, right?
Sounds like dinner. But,
He was a priest. He was a priest, a guerrilla priest, who would raid the homes of the wealthy, especially the patrons in Florence, the Lorenzi family, and they would take out the works of art, violins, everything like that, paintings, sculptures, and burn them in the piazza. And they called them the bonfires of the vanities. Nobody's heard of Savonarola, who destroyed art. Everybody knows Michelangelo, and he's been witnessing to the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. Every Italian restaurant you go into, there's God creating Adam. There's the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Images that are famous throughout all the world. So the power of art to convey the gospel, while religion is trying to destroy it, we who are filled with the Holy Spirit need to be promoting it. Yeah.
so, based on everything...
I just want to go on to another point here, sorry. When I said 10 things that block, I think another point is an interesting point, that most artists' biographies talk about how they painted out of pain. They went through a terrible period in their life. Now, you talked about going through a boring period in your life. And then they paint pain. So that very often today, painting and artistry and music, people will talk about how it got birthed in a moment of darkness and pain, and often it represents pain.
Sure.
But I think that's such a small view of God. I paint on schedule. I do not paint on moments of feelings.
Right.
I say between 3 and 4 o'clock this afternoon, I'll do 10 paintings. Wow. And so I go down to my studio, do the paintings. It's not like I am waiting for inspiration. I can schedule my inspiration, and I can schedule it. I don't have to wait for pain. Secondly, I do not want to present pain to the world. I want to present bright, light, happy, glorious things. And some would say, well, that's not real art. It's nonsense. Of course it's real art. And it's bringing art, making art useful. Never think that music or these are not useful. They are the most human-enhancing elements we have. Yep. Nobody goes to have their lunch in a car park. They all want to go by the river and under a tree in a beautiful environment. And that's the job of art, to create an enhanced human experience that is fully developing and mentally stabilizing for people.
Awesome. Oh, so many questions. I go back a little bit and just ask what you said before about, you're talking about Michelangelo and all these things. And I have I'm not the only one that thinks this, but the church used to drive, I feel, art in culture a lot more. Would you agree? Like the church was where art was birthed out of that, and I suppose we have lost ground in the culture, and maybe it's become a bit more derivative. I mean, like Chardon, maybe you can answer this, bro. But like, what's what's the role that creativity needs to play in the future of the church, and how can we get back to that spot where we're kind of influencing culture again, rather than copying?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I think of the modern day church, I actually get excited and the more I travel, I'm seeing churches that are taking risks and maybe doing things that haven't been done before versus pulling back and retreating in creativity. Maybe it's just the churches I happen to visit or what, but I'm sure Pastor Phil has a lot more experience. But I'm feeling more enthused when I visit churches, seeing churches that have senior pastors that, like yourselves, are leading the value system of creativity in our churches. I think one of the things in the modern day church that we probably could do better, I believe, is actually championing people in the art forms outside of the church four walls. Right. So when there's artists that are photographers, fashion designers, that rather than trying to say, oh, we need you in the church to design for our church's label, no, actually their artwork that they're creating, that label that their apparel that they're doing is actually going to influence so many more people in Milan if we actually champion them to create what God's gifted them with, even outside the four walls. Yeah. We've got great musicians, I think, back in the day. Oh, you're a traveling musician, you're in a band that's becoming influential. Oh, but we need to make sure you're on the bass every, second week on the roster and make sure you practice and all that. And I think long gone, like those days are gone. Like for us at City Point, if we've got a guy in our church who's on The Voice or doing really well, we as the church need to champion that person that's actually called by God to influence their sphere for God. Not that we don't let them come into our team and when they're available or they're in town that they can still use their gift for God in the house of God also, but not to see that as a competitive thing, like, oh, you're secular versus Christian. No, he's actually a man of God who's been gifted by God, who's actually reaching a sphere far beyond the four walls of your building in your suburb, and that's not a threat to the church. That's actually, I believe, outworking the call of God on his life. So we as the church, I know for us in our creative team, in our collective, we look for opportunities to celebrate those in their creative art forms that are actually doing something completely out of the walls of City Point because they're influencing their world for good and for God. And so I think having the awareness maybe of the importance of not seeing it as a threat is maybe a healthy opportunity for a church to celebrate that. And I think it actually helps young people take risks when they're, oh, should I be a worship pastor and do what I've seen modeled? But I actually have the gift in photography and could be shooting, in Paris. Well, let's pray into that because it's not one or the other. You could probably do both. You could minister outside the four walls as well as being a minister in the house of God. That's cool. So that's probably my viewpoint on that, yeah.
Yeah, it's if we're to be in the marketplace, it means you're in the marketplace. And you got to celebrate those people who actually make it there. The difference is that the church is way too tolerant of shabby performance. We are not committed to excellence. So for any artist thinking they're going to do what they do in church out there, they will be severely disappointed. My son and daughter-in-law recently wrote a song and produced a song for Katy Perry, which was number one in the world for about 3 days. It's never really over. I don't know if you've heard it. It's a pop song. Well, they wrote and produced that. Wow. And they write and produce for quite a few. Selena Gomez, quite a few of these people. And they've had a bumpy road trying to walk that line between staying Christian and being swung over into a world, but they have to put up with a lot of anti-God world stuff, right. Just like Daniel did in Babylon. So being able to talk Babylon and yet remain a believer is a pretty interesting exercise. And I know a few actors and models and people in that industry who it is not easy. The only reason I would say that people should not go there if they're too weak as a believer.
Yeah, that's good.
Because the cocaine parties and all of that. My son and daughter-in-law made a decision. We do not go to the party after the after party. They said, we went to one and it's way out crazy. kinky, crazy, the whole lot. So, and yet we had a pastor's wife in LA who refused to go to the pajama party at the Playboy Mansion because she thought it was too ungodly. We said, why? You should go. Because that's who you're there to reach.
Yeah, right.
And to get amongst them and show them a different spirit and all that sort of thing. You don't have to do what they do. But we've got to be, if we're going to be amongst it, you can't be sort of saying, oh no, I don't go there and I can't do this. You're actually in the marketplace.
Yeah, wow.
You're in the boardroom where they're making a bad decision. They're trying to change the minute from last week's meeting so they make a higher profit. You got to be in these situations. Not that you always going to be in agreement with it. I know working with politicians, they have such a hard time. When we went through decriminalisation of homosexuality in New South Wales, some of our guys just were caught right in the middle of that. And I see it all the time in these guys. Very difficult decisions to make. Denzel Washington, some of the movies he's had to make. Well, he didn't have to make them, but he's agreed to make them to try and convey a message to the world that the wages of sin is death. So that's why he did Training Day, which is one of the most, I wouldn't advise anybody see it. But it's like, these are interesting moments where we should support believers in those circumstances because the temptations and the opportunities to lose their Christianity, if you like, are really high, so high. And I've watched good people, who have gone that way in The Voice. We had a contestant this year, Pringle Stevens, and she's a great singer, but she's so solid in God, so solid in the church. We have no problem with her mixing it up in all of that. Awesome. And if they can put some boundaries in their lives, we don't go to the after parties, we don't do this, and so they just say no, we don't do that. And neither of my boys drink, and so they just say, yeah, we'll have water, thanks, and all this kind of thing. So it's kept them, and they've been able to keep their head above the water and reach. That's as high as you can get. They've reached, a peak here, which will open a lot of doors for them to have a worldwide #1 hit. It's but it is creatives are, by their nature, who are given to an entire career of creativity, going to be a more reflective, sensitive personality.
Yes.
And so guarding that becomes more crucial.
Could I even just add to that, even on a pastoral care level, within your creative teams, can I encourage you to be prepared and ready for the inundation of full-time creatives in the industries, that you even have a pastoral care pastor, or at least volunteer, that their whole job isn't actually the team on a Sunday setting, but it's actually a team that are traveling in London, or they're over in Japan, we're keeping in touch with them, checking in, how are you going? Are you going to the after party? Right. And and even having that dialogue with them of, we're with you, by the way. You might not have been at church in 3 months, but we're still praying for you. You're still part of the house of God. And then you're giving the opportunity, when they are surrounded by so many circumstances on a daily basis, to actually have that divine wisdom saying, hey, let's have a prayer about that together. Let's chat about that Playboy Mansion thing. Do you feel like you're strong enough in your faith? Are you going in on purpose, led by the Holy Spirit? What are you going to do in these moments? I think it's actually when we can be the church that is prepared for knowing there's a whole community within your church that God's going to grace you with to go out of the 4 walls, then to not have a pastoral care focus for those group of people is almost a bit naive, I think. And I think, in fact, if you structure that in advance before, maybe you say, oh, well, we don't have anyone in full-time ministry or in a famous band, or that's in design, in that level. But I think it's amazing when we foster and prophetically prepare our structures as creatives, because sometimes I think creative teams can appear like really unadministrative, or like we don't know how to do a roster, or we don't know how to corporately do a structure. But I think that's a myth. I'll just get an administrator in your team, maybe. That's maybe what you need to do if it's crazy artists. But I think structurally, something we've valued in our church is, if we're going to have a leader over the vocal team, or a leader over the dance team, or a leader over our visual arts team, why would we not have a leader over our creative evangelists? And if anything, like Pastor Phil said, the importance of keeping that relationship when they are seeing crazy things, I think is actually our responsibility as the church to prepare for that. Yeah.
I love that. I just met a man last Wednesday night who is up working with the hospo team, cooking dinner. He's doing the dishes. Now, this man, his name's Bob, and I found out the other night that he works 6 months of a year on a $400 million super yacht, running all the stuff for famous people and whatnot. And here he is in our church doing dishes for the dinners. And I just think that there are a lot of people in our church that are like that, and it's just beautiful to see people that are in the world, but they're also, that they're not above serving in the church and extending and building the kingdom, washing dishes, whatever as well. And so I think that, as a church, we're really buzzing right now about our future, reaching the world through the church for the kingdom, but reaching outside of the four walls through making movies and things like that. We've had the prophetic word over our church and stuff like that. And I suppose, I want to do something special at the end, so probably just a couple more questions. But, I can't remember if we answered it before. I'll throw it to you, bro, first, Pastor Chardon. And that
call
is...
me bro.
Sorry.
Cool.
No, not at all. Bro Pringle, bro Chardon, Lewis. So shouldn't be doing these things. Anyway, how do you see creativity changing the world? Do you see it? Do you see it as a vital role? Speak to us as a church and where we're wanting to go. Do you think it's important? Do you think it's evangelism? Is creativity a way that we can reach the world?
It's not even just it's essential. It's how could you not? I believe the church is, in fact. I think maybe some churches could tap into it more, but I think globally, what I've seen, Pastor Phil, you've seen a lot more, but I believe the church is valuing creativity more than I've seen in a long time. Maybe even on the edge of, Pastor Phil was saying, the importance of excellence of creativity, not just doing dance, but it's horrific and everyone's embarrassed to watch the dance group on the stage. But I think we've maybe been doing it for a while, but there's this new in, I think because of social media, with the ability to see so many great creatives in an instant. You can look at a service on the other side of the world on a Monday of what happened on a Sunday. So all of a sudden we're exposed without having to watch a DVD or hear a report from your senior pastor who comes back home after a trip and trying to interpret what they've seen. And but I think visually we've never had such a great opportunity to see creativity in such a... If that makes sense? So for me, I believe that because of that, we're seeing churches step in the spirit of excellence like never before. And things that were once okay with, the awkward acting, when you're we don't know where to look because it's so cringeworthy. All of a sudden we're having churches that, if we're going to put on a production, let's put on a world-class production that people that don't love God, don't have an interest in church, when they do come into the house of God, they're actually inspired by the creativity that this is actually not what they thought would be church, right? And so even the creative opener with the rain, I'm this can't just be we hope that happens or we hope this No, that's an essential ingredient to the things of God in the house of God. And so I feel excited, to be honest. I feel like we're on this new wave and a surge of creativity that we're doing things outside of the box and we're not sticking to cringeworthy songwriting and cringeworthy dance groups. And all of a sudden we're seeing, and excellence attracts excellence. If your church is actually valuing creativity with the spirit of excellence, all of a sudden you're finding these people, hey, I actually have been dancing professionally for 13 years. My wife's from Canada, she's a dancer, and she moved to Australia, and all of a sudden she was in our church as a new person 15 years ago and thought there's no way in heck I want to join this dance team. I'm not out of a spirit of pride, but I'm embarrassed to be on stage with the team because they don't have any training, right? And all of a sudden it's will you be the change? It's let's start some auditions and let's not ridicule the acting, but let's upskill. Let's get people actually valuing the importance of actually increasing their gift from God, separate to church, and then coming midweek to let's collaborate some talent here. So for me, I think it's essential, and I think we've never valued it so much, which excites me. But there's so much more. We want to push the boundaries. I know I'm 35 now, but I love seeing some 17, 18-year-olds coming up with new ideas. I'm I would never have thought of that, but I'm so glad you're in our team because you're coming up with new ideas, and I don't want to be, naive to the fact that I have, a 1984 way of doing things, but there's a new generation coming through that actually have new ways of thinking and see things through a new eye. And so we need the importance of generations in our teams of all generations, from young and to elderly, together working and collaborating. So I don't know, I feel excited when I think the church is valuing creativity more than ever before. But it's that spirit of excellence of, how can we do this better? Not just to be better or be perfect, excellence isn't perfection. But what excellence is, it's evangelism to people that come and say, maybe there is a God. Like that song that was probably tweaked on and worked on and produced for months behind the scenes, now presented live on a Sunday setting, there's something in that excellence and the production of that song that's now triggered me to a way that I'm open to maybe the word of God that's about to come. So I think it's essential for us as a church,
I think the generation of screens is upon us too. And kids spend so much more time on screens than any previous generation. So to become masters of the screen, we teach in our college, we have a creative arts college, which teaches 7 streams of creativity: dance, music, songwriting, singing, musicianship, film, video, and art. So the art zone, they do drawing and painting, but the main reason we want all of those gifts to be able to be useful in church, and actually most of them end up in screen or studio presentations, because the ability to enhance a worship experience with imaging on a screen, the ability to communicate with the congregation a vision through an interview or a screen presentation or a movie. I was just looking up Genevieve Clay Smith, who's in our Mossman congregation, who won Tropfest, which is the largest small film festival. It's not just doing a movie, but the content of the movie was working with Down syndrome, a child, and working through so that this child actually becomes a hero. And it becomes such a compassionate, beautiful movie, bringing the feeling of what it is to be a Christian to the world. So it's not just doing a great movie, which she has done. And now this year she was nominated Young Businesswoman of the Year as well. And her husband got the Small Businessman's of the Year, Doobie Wacker. And so now they, through their excellence of not just the packaging, but the message, the content, which definitely plucked the heartstrings of the officials, now has put her in a position of influence at a very young age. She's only a young kid. And so because of doing a good content excellently, now she's able to talk at government levels about policies to do with those people. So I think when we say, does creativity have a future for the church in the marketplace, I don't think we've got a future without it. Honestly, I think if we're just thinking we're going to have computer operators and store clerks, and which I'm not putting any of those down, I think, but you do not want to think that that is the beginning and ending of your creativity. One of the other blocks, and I'll finish with this, out of those 10 blocks, I think this is number 4 or 5, is that art is hard work. For some reason, people looking on at an artist doing their thing, they think, oh, they're just so gifted and talented, it just sort of comes to them. But no song, no piece of music, no acting part, no good movie comes without really hard work. And so don't think that being an artist is a lazy way to wealth or something. You got to throw out a lot of paintings. You got to work a long way. I was in Taipei last weekend, and this guy gave me an iPad, and it had, it was a special iPad that felt like paper when you drew on it. So I tested it out, and I drew a face, like 30-second face. And he said, "Whoa!" He said, "Sign it." Sign it. He says, he took a photo of it. Now I know that you really are an artist. You can actually draw, because most of my paintings don't look like I can draw. they're just squiggles and splashes of paint and all this kind of thing. But I have spent hours and hours and hours drawing figures, getting my eye-hand motivation, coordination correct, and getting feeling into the painting. So a painting might take, a few minutes, but actually it's like 40 years of other stuff behind that. And it's like a preacher, his message. Somebody says, well, how long take to prepare a message? I say like, about 30 minutes and 40 years.
Wow. That's literally like, I'm looking for my wife right now because I feel like, were you listening in on a conversation we had last night? But it's so true. One of my pet peeves, we were talking about this.
I was not wherever you were in your
Right.
bedroom or I
didn't feel like you needed
that,
vibe
clarify.
came, you know,
I don't think you needed to qualify that. I mean, like, I thought that was quite obvious. But I didn't get the laugh I expected, so thank you. When people say, "Oh, that's gifting," that's just so talented, they don't see, like you say, the hours that it takes, the hard work. And I agree with you completely. I love what you said about right brain versus left brain and how the world's going that way. I feel like it's linked to what you said, that creativity is becoming more valued in our culture. And man, and when you're talking about the screens, everyone is looking at screens. We have been talking about that as a church, and I feel like, traditionally the church has looked with disdain on the way the world is going and seen it as like a problem instead of an opportunity. Yeah. And we were just talking the other day about, like, we've got now, we call them the zombies or whatever, that everyone's just looking at this. And Sammy and I are always talking about how that's an opportunity. Totally. Like, God is setting the world up for a move that the world has, the early church would kill. To be alive today, to get the message out there that we can, when literally it's like God is directing everybody's eyes to one place, even in third world countries, that we can get our message to. I feel like He's setting up the culture for the greatest move of God that we can ever see through media, through creativity. That's what gets me going. And so I just want to thank you guys so much for coming today, speaking into that. And we just love you guys. We honor you guys. And